After having concluded his visit to Brunei, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has arrived in Singapore to deepen strategic partnership ties with Singapore at the invitation of Prime Minister Lawrence Wong. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has come to Singapore. He has met with his Singapore counterpart to deepen strategic partnership with the Southeast Asian country at the invitation of his Singaporean counterpart. And upon his arrival, the Prime Minister received a rousing reception from the Indian community, and the two world leaders were spotted exchanging iconic handshake and a hug. Let's start off our conversation, and we're going to dive deep into the trade and the diplomatic aspects of the two countries, India and Singapore, and how there has been every single effort that has been put to improve these ties. I have with me Ambassador J.K. Tripathi. Let's hear it from you, sir, with regards to the key points that have been raised by both the leaders of the states. And of course, trade is at the top of all agendas that are being brought forth by the Indian Prime Minister and his Singapore counterpart, keeping in mind that Singapore is a leading semiconductor manufacturer, a chip manufacturer, and the largest trade that India has with ASEAN, any nation across Asia, is with Singapore.
Thank you very much, Megha, and good evening to all the co-panelists. Yes, you are right. The relations between India and Singapore are more based on the trade, more based on the other areas relating to trade, and what they have discussed. As far as my information is that they have discussed about advanced manufacturing, they have discussed about digitization, they have discussed about enhancing the already existing strategic partnership between India and Singapore. And as you have rightly said, India observed the FDI from Singapore to India is in 2023 was $11.77 billion, which was largest among FDI from ASEAN countries. And more than that, we have with Singapore the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, which itself opens new vistas about the investment. And we have more than 5 lakh Indians living there, or Indians or people of Indian origin, who are at various high levels, including the president who is of Tamil origin. Now, these things, these things apart, with Singapore we have in 2022 started a ministerial round conference, India-Singapore ministerial round conference, which was attended by the External Affairs Minister, the Finance Minister, the Commerce Minister, and this year Railway Minister as well, because he is the Minister for Railways and Information and Broadcasting, Ashwini Vaishnaw. Trade, as you have observed, trade between the two countries have been $35.6 billion, where $14.5 billion worth of goods we exported to Singapore, and we have imported goods worth $21.2 million. Cumulative FDI from Singapore has been at a staggering $159.94 billion. So these things, these figures and these data, they speak volumes about the size of trade we have. More than 9,000 Indian companies are present in Singapore, and more than 440 Singaporean companies are present here. So this itself shows that Singapore is a very vital trade partner for us.
Okay.
And yeah.
Okay. All right.
Sure.
Professor Madhav Nalapat, I'm going to just list out the number of times there have been visits either from countries from Southeast Asia and their heads of states who have arrived in India in the past few months, or whether it has been our External Affairs Minister or our Prime Minister or our President arriving and meeting and greeting these heads of states from the other Southeast Asian countries. And there you have it. It was External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar who was in Laos for the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting that took place in July. In August, it was President Murmu who travelled to Fiji and New Zealand and Timor-Leste. This happened in August, and then it was the Vietnam and the Malaysian Prime Ministers who had arrived in Delhi. This again happened in August. Prime Minister Narendra Modi decides to pick these two countries in Southeast Asia, that's Brunei and Singapore, to visit and make his presence felt. And in October, India will be at the ASEAN Summit meetings in Laos. So these choices that the Prime Minister and the External Affairs Ministers make when picking a nation and then paying a visit to the head of the state, these are strategic, these are well thought out, and what's the thought behind them?
Well, I'd like to agree with what you have said. These are strategic, these are well thought out. And so far as Singapore is concerned, I'm very heartened to learn that the Singapore Wealth Fund is investing a significant amount of money and is going to double that investment over the next few years, because the Singapore Wealth Fund is a very cautious fund. It's a very well-managed fund, and it looks only at a very clear, good opportunity for investment. There's no playing around with the Singapore fund. There's no question of goodwill or anything. It's a question of hard business. So when they take that kind of a decision, it means that for sovereign funds, now you've got a large fund in Kuwait, for example, a huge fund. You have other countries that have got huge sovereign funds. It could be the precursor to other sovereign funds investing more in India, which would then create a large number of jobs and, of course, significant increase in output. So I'm very heartened by that. As far as Singapore is concerned, yes, it's a very, very well-run, well-managed country, and you have a very significant Indian population there, including the president, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, who's an outstanding as a statesperson. But then the reality is that Singapore and India have always thought of each other as good friends for a very long time, for decades, as a matter of fact. And that's only been strengthened under Prime Minister Modi. Prime Minister Modi said we will no longer just look east, we will act east. And he's doing exactly that. He's not just looking, he's acting. And you can see that in the huge number of agreements that have been signed across the board with the ASEAN countries. And I think that is a very welcome sign. But this is one of the most dynamic parts of the global economy. India is also a very dynamic part. And if these two dynamic parts work together, I think it will be good for both sides, Megha.
Absolutely. Let's also hear it from Mr. Kohli, who's joining me on the telecast, and let's hear it from you talking about the economic aspect of it. Like I said, I'm going to repeat it, that Singapore is the largest trading partner of India in Asia. Which are the areas that we can further enhance when it comes to our economic relations? Chip manufacturing, something that is important. We have also started off with our semiconductor hubs that we are trying to create, with the manufacturing plants that we are setting up across the country, especially in the southern part of the country. How can Singapore help in this aspect?
Well, good evening, Megha, and good evening to my fellow panelists and NewsX viewers. Yeah, I think Singapore plays a double role, Megha, for me. One, Singapore as a city-state, per se, it's not a very large country. It's a very small place. So like shipbuilding, chip manufacturing, and some of the other financial centers which are there in Singapore for Singapore. But for me, the larger picture of Singapore comes what something like Dubai is doing for West Asia and Europe. It becomes a hub It becomes a center from where a lot of investments come into India. I mean, not many people know, or maybe people who are connected with the world of investment, they know that a lot of investment by way of FPIs, the foreign portfolio investors and the foreign institutional investors, they come via Singapore. In fact, until the time we had the GIFT Center in Ahmedabad, SGX Nifty, which is Singapore Stock Exchange's indice, was a benchmark for the Indian markets to open in the morning. So such was the dependence on Singapore. Well, Singapore, we should not forget, is a very, very important financial hub. And a lot of investments, in fact, there is a downside to that also, Megha, which I must point out here, that a lot of Chinese investments which are not directly involved in a proxy form, they also take the Singapore road, which is why the government of India, when they do the KYC or the due diligence for the investments coming via Singapore, they have to be very careful if there is any malified intention of bringing in a banned Chinese investment into the country. And I think, for me, China is also a threat as far as India-Singapore relations are concerned, because China will try and sabotage Indo-Singapore relations. But I think with Prime Minister's visit, things are going to get strengthened. And I think the bilateral trade between the two countries right now is about, I would say, 35 billion. Singapore is the 6th largest trading partner for India. But there is still a trade deficit as far as India is concerned. We are importing more than what we are exporting. And the reason for that is, again, I would say China, because as I said, a lot of proxy investment, a lot of proxy exports from China happen via Singapore. But Singapore is also a very tax-friendly place. There is something which is called a low tax haven. It's not a zero tax haven. That the corporate tax rates are very attractive in Singapore. So a lot of investments, they set up their companies there, they set up their bases there, and then they try. Obviously, sometimes it leads to money laundering kind of a thing also, where people try and misuse the privilege. But now with the filtration, which is in the Indian regulatory mechanism, it is very difficult for such kind of money to come and establish base in India. So therefore, Singapore remains very strategic geographically. Another challenge that I see in the trade, Megha, is the South China Sea tensions, because Singapore is at a location where you cannot bypass South China Sea. So the Chinese dominance or the Chinese mischief in the South China Sea, or China's nefarious attentions in South China Sea, that is a little bit of dampener as far as Indo-Singapore trade route is concerned. But I'm sure Prime Minister's visit will help in overcoming these problems and I'm sure this is on the agenda also, because how Prime Minister decides to overcome this and how the Singapore government comes forward to make sure that these bottlenecks, these roadblocks are removed to facilitate seamless and smoothless trade to the Eastern Hemisphere, Megha.
You're right. And in talking about the balance of trade and the trade deficit that India faces with regards to having trade relations with Singapore, which are these aspects that can be catered to by India to allow for some balance to appear between both countries?
The Make in India initiative of India becoming the manufacturing hub, and Singapore-China relations, by the way, we didn't discuss about that. They are very, very strong relations. A lot of ethnic population in Singapore still has Chinese origin, apart from the Tamilians which are there in Singapore. So I think India will have to make sure that its goods are cost effective. The tariff structure is more rationalized, because we will have to beat China in terms of bilateral trade. The moment we are able to do that, I think we are on track. We may not be there yet, but we are on track. We are in the right direction. The moment we are able to rationalize tariffs, the moment we are able to overcome the problems which I just mentioned about, I was talking about the South China Sea, and China is also trying to influence some of the surrounding countries. I'm talking of Myanmar, I'm talking of Malaysia, I'm talking of Indonesia, Thailand. China is trying all out to make sure that it tries and corners India on trade front also. I think a solution will have to be found, and we are in the right direction with such an authoritarian, such a perfectly directed leadership that we have. I'm sure we'll be able to overcome, and China will have to, get embarrassed at some point of time if it is moving forward with malified intentions.
Chirayu Thakkar, as Dr. Shahid Kohli rightly pointed out, the China factor is the single most debilitating factor for India to grow its relations with the other ASEAN nations. There are certain countries like Philippines and Brunei who have put forth their vehement public protest against the Chinese aggression in the maritime territories, but there are several others like Singapore and Thailand who continue to have very cordial trade relations, and they would like this to continue because it's beneficial for them as well to get Chinese goods, to buy Chinese services and goods and bring them back into the country, and of course their equipment and their manufacturing and their products travel all the way to China as well. How should India play a competitive role in being able to be an important towering figure in the Southeast Asian map?
Good evening, Megha, and thank you for having me. I think very valid and some of very important points have been made by my fellow panelists. I would like to add two major things to that. First, regarding China, as you rightly pointed out, that currently the ASEAN countries, the Southeast Asian countries, they are facing a huge challenge. But if you see, and the challenges of US-China competition, but if you see if one country which has like very strategically managed those strides, that is Singapore. On the one hand, Singapore continues to be one of the major trading partners of China. It's an entrepot, so it also engages in a lot of transshipment of Chinese goods. But on the other hand, it continues to be a strategically important partner of the United States. It hosts some of the most important warships of United States in the region, and that way it has found a balance. Also, Singapore, it may not have taken a very public position on the 9-dash line or the South China Sea, and is trying to evade this as long as possible. I remember Prime Minister Lee writing an essay in Foreign Affairs saying that we are not interested in this US-China competition and don't force this competition upon us. But on the other hand, it has successfully managed, and it has also in the past burned its own hands. Remember, Singapore tried to help Taiwan in some case, and its vehicles, they were going in the high seas and they were impounded by China. So Singapore is a country that has witnessed Chinese aggression firsthand. It knows that if they allow Beijing they give you free hand in Southeast Asia, it will only burn its hands again and again and again. So this is again another very important aspect where India-Singapore ties in strategic domain should be augmented. And there is Singapore plays a very important role. Much before we started an international fusion center here in India, Singapore was doing a regional maritime domain awareness both in Indian as well as Pacific oceans through its own international fusion center. That's a very important aspect for a small country to do, knowing what China's intentions are. So that's one aspect. Second, to add to what has been said thus far, Singapore also is a gateway to ASEAN. You have to remember that Singapore is a country that punches much above its weight through ASEAN and within ASEAN. Within ASEAN, 9 countries are single-handedly on one side on admission of Timor-Leste or East Timor, but it is single-handedly Singapore is preventing its admission. And that shows its weight. And it also shows its weight through ASEAN that it is punching in global affairs. And there's one point I would like to add, because I'm at National University of Singapore and we do this annual survey of elites, be it people from business, academia, everywhere. And India currently has a very low approval rating, barring 2 or 3 countries. Let's say Philippines, Brunei is one of them, Singapore is one of them. Rest 7 countries within ASEAN, our approval ratings are very less because we neither have strategic engagement, we don't have economic engagement, despite having the India-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement in 2010. And I think Singapore could be our gateway to further intensification of engagement with remaining ASEAN states, because remember, without ASEAN centrality, there is no Indo-Pacific, there is no Quad, and therefore I think it is important that Prime Minister has chosen this timely visit at the start of his 3rd term, and our ties with Singapore should be enhanced strategically, economically, trade-wise, and in all domains possible.
Okay. All right. Professor Madhanalapat, again coming to you. Now, again, this has been pointed out by other panelists as well. But when it comes to strife that is being witnessed by India in its neighborhood, whether it is about the hostility that it is witnessing in Bangladesh in terms of the change of regime, in Sri Lanka, Nepal, they have all gotten, prone to Chinese influence. in such a situation, when India reaches out and goes to Southeast Asia and ASEAN, how should it tackle its affairs?
Look, Megha, there's a very compelling case to forget about any gateway, any ASEAN country as a gateway. A country of 1.4 billion people, which is rising fast, needs its own gateway. And I think one thing that Singapore can teach India is regulations and rules. And they have quite a simplified system of regulation and rules. They have a very, very investor-friendly tax regime. And I'm absolutely certain that one of the missions of Prime Minister Modi when he's in Singapore will be to study the regime and to find out what changes need to be made in India in the GST and tax regime so that India can become a gateway, a hub. And believe me, we have the potential on both coasts, on the West Coast and the East Coast, to become such a hub. So I think that is going to be a very important point. And I'd like to again add that when we talk about India, 1.4 billion people, I don't think we need a gateway. What we need is to have many gateways within India, and I'm quite certain this must be on the Prime Minister's mind, Megha.
Okay. Ambassador J.K. Tripathi, would you like to add to that? Act East policy, 10th anniversary. How much more time for India to establish its presence the way China has in ASEAN?
Well, you know, China was the early starter and we were late. So that's the reason why we are still lagging behind. But nevertheless, we are catching up fast, if not economically or politically, certainly, and strategically, as you would have seen that we have defense cooperation with Vietnam, we have defense cooperation with Philippines, we have defense cooperation with Indonesia, we just had signed a defense cooperation agreement with Brunei. So, and we have of course agreement with Australia. So all these things clearly indicate that India has arrived in ASEAN. If you look at the broader picture, not only the picture about commerce or about trade, then in a broader picture you will find that Indians have got better respect than Chinese now. Chinese have got only respect or out of fear just because of their sheer size of their economy or their trade with all these countries. Most of them are dependent on many things on China. But what we have proved to the ASEAN countries that we can prove to be a dependent, a trustworthy partner, and that is what is working. I think though it is working slowly but steadily, and I feel that in 2 or 3 years' time you will see India's image in ASEAN countries has changed for a positive in a positive direction.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right. Okay.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.